Thank you all for coming. I guess as long as we have crises in the world, we'll have packed ballrooms, people eager to talk about them. We do have an excellent panel of 4 speakers, so I want to start off by introducing them. Proceeding from my right, Richard Baldwin is Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. He's editor-in-chief of voxeu.org, and as of last week, he is president of the CEPR in London. Next to him, Thomas Sampson is professor in economics at the London School of Economics. He is one of the co-authors of a prominent, I think the most prominent, series of studies in Britain of the likely effects of Brexit on the economy via trade, investment, maybe something on immigration. Next to him is Hélène Ray, professor of economics at the London Business School. She's a member of the commission that advises the French Minister of Finance, and she is a winner of an amazingly large number of prestigious academic prizes. And last is Anil, Kashyap, the Edward Eagle Brown Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Many claims to fame, among them member of the Squam Lake Group and the Bellagio Group. As Jim indicated, we're going to start off with an initial round of comments from each of the participants. I've asked them to try to limit that to 7 minutes. And I've, to cut down on overlap, I've assigned them specific aspects of this many-faceted topic. Then we'll have a second round where they can comment on each other. That part is all on the record. When that is done, we'll go to off-the-record question and answer discussion. I'll tell you what I've assigned them one by one. I've asked Richard Baldwin to speak first and to focus on what this says in the longer-term perspective of European integration.
Thank you, Jeff. Brexit. It's complicated, as Jim said, and that's the first thing you got to say about it, and maybe the only thing you really got to say about it. If you have watched British politics in the last few weeks, it's unpredictable. European politics is equally unpredictable. But let me look at that complexity a little bit. I mean, the reason it's complex is because to understand what happened and what will happen gets you into a jumble of UK politics and EU politics, all tangled up with misinformation and wishful thinking. And we could spend all day talking about all the different things, all that, but I'm going to focus on the misthinking and the wishful thinking in my 7 minutes. Now, let me just start with the misthinking, and I'm going to focus on trade and trade policy. I would invite you to think about there being really 2 types of trade: 20th century trade and 21st century trade. Now, 20th century trade is the type that you all know, you learned about in university, and most of you probably teach your students about it. It means goods crossing borders. Stuff is made in one country and it's sold in another country, and that's what trade is. Now, trade policy, when trade is that, is quite simple. Basically, all you have to do is get the border barriers down, tariffs and quotas, and you're good to go. If your companies have access to their market without border barriers, you have free trade. If they have access to yours, you have overall free trade. Trade policy is very simple. 21st century trade is significantly more complicated. Sometime in the late 1980s, the ICT revolution made it possible to organize really complex activities at greater distances. And many companies, especially in manufacturing, took advantage of this by fragmenting the production process and putting them across borders. So 21st century trade is not just goods crossing borders, it's factories crossing borders. And that changed things significantly because the flows of goods, services, information, capital, training, the flows that used to happen inside a firm, inside one country, inside a factory to keep things smoothly going, that's now part of international commerce. This international production networks made international commerce much more complex and much more entangled, because all these flows are pushed together. So don't think about trade in goods as different than trade in services, investment, intellectual property. Those are part and parcel of the whole thing. Now, what it means, I'm coming back to Brexit, is this is exactly what the single market is about in Europe. In fact, you really shouldn't even think about the single market as a trade agreement. You should think about it as a set of rules that allows this international production network to thrive. And that's relevant because that's why the UK's relationship with the EU is so important. Not because of a few tariffs, but because the UK is part of factory Europe. And since they want to have a favorable position, they have to be in the single market, which assures that these flows of goods, services, people, information, all that stuff flows seamlessly, not just from Britain to them, but from them to Britain. In other words, it underpins factory Asia. Now, fortunately, Britain has a prime minister, at least will in about 4 hours, who is not one of the ones misthinking trade. The campaign was filled with people who just simply wanted to talk about tariffs and whatnot. But now we know since yesterday that they're going to have a prime minister who really understands that the UK has to be in the single market. Now, this brings me to the wishful thinking part. Now, in my view, the only real way that the UK can assure, and this isn't thinking alone, people like Thomas and many other people have said this, but the only real option for the UK to have single market access is to join the European Economic Area Agreement or something very like it, which is often called the Norway option. So there are a set of little countries around the EU who did not want to join but did want to be inside the single market, and that's what they created this thing for. So the UK can get that. Now, the wishful thinking part is that she thinks she can cherry pick the single market. In particular, she likes the single market for almost everything except the free mobility of labor. And the single market, the 4 freedoms, which are part and parcel, they are not separable: free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And what she would like is the first 3, but not the last 3, not the last one. Now, in my mind, that is not possible whatsoever. And people like Prime Minister May think that the UK has sufficient bargaining that they can get a better deal than Norway. But that is really looking in the wrong place. The problem is this is not going to be a negotiation between the EU over here and the UK over here. It's first going to be a negotiation among 27 countries, each of which has a veto. And when they're done, they're going to talk to the UK. So the problem is that there was 3 million more people, Brits, who voted to leave than to remain. And the 27 EU leaders are not going to allow those 3 million voters to threaten a single market that serves 500 million people and covers a fifth of world production. So the UK will very soon find out that this is a take it or leave it package as they go forward. Now, really, there's 2 reasons there for why it's take or leave it. First of all, they want to maintain the cohesion of the single market, just a practical matter. If somebody started unpicking it, like the Brits, each of the 27 countries would like to take it except one little thing, and the single market would very soon become 28 single markets. And therefore, I was hoping you were going to like that one. Anyways, I worked on that one a long time. But the second thing is that a lot of the sitting national leaders are afraid of their own anti-EU fringe. And they think that if they create a halfway house, this will incite the anti-EU fringe to be bolder than they were otherwise. So for both reasons, I think Prime Minister May will very soon find out that it's a take it or leave it deal. And at that point, she will have to decide who she's going to disappoint. In my 49 seconds, I would like to just mention that the UK has 2 other trade policy headaches. First of all, the UK's WTO membership is entangled with that of the EU in ways we can talk about if you're interested in it. And there are third country trade deals with over 100 countries that the UK will have to figure out how to redo those things. But I'll leave that for discussion. Just stop right there.
Perfect. Thank you. Our second speaker is Thomas Sampson, who's going to talk about what Brexit means for trade and foreign direct investment.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to focus my remarks on the long-run consequences of Brexit, and particularly on thinking about what it means for the UK economy. So broadly speaking, there have been kind of three methodologies that people have adopted when trying to address this question of what Brexit is going to mean for the UK. So I'd like to say kind of a few words about each method and give you an overview of what people have found. So the first approach that has been used is kind of backward looking, and it asks what happened to the UK after it joined the European Economic Community as it was then in 1973. Right? So between 1973 and the eve of the financial crisis in 2007, the UK's GDP per capita increased relative to kind of countries like France, Germany, or the US. So that was a period in which the UK economy performed reasonably well. And the more sophisticated version of that observation, there's a paper by Campos, Coricelli, and Moretti, who use a synthetic counterfactual approach to look at what were the consequences of joining the EU for the UK. They find that 10 years after accession, the UK's GDP per capita was 8.6% higher than it otherwise would have been. So they're finding there, quite a big positive effect. Now, obviously, even if we accept that estimate at face value, there's good reasons to think that the effects of joining the EU and of leaving might not be symmetric. So the second approach people have taken is a more forward-looking approach, asking if we start from where the economy is now, and then we look at the Brexit shock, what would that mean? So this is a question that has mainly been addressed using quantitative CGE trade models. We've done a lot of work on this area at LSE using a version of the Eaton and Kortum trade model. And when you come to model Brexit within this framework, what Brexit means is a shock to trade costs. So the key question is, what exactly would Brexit mean for trade costs? And for the reasons Richard has already alluded to, there's a lot of uncertainty there. But so what people have done is to consider various different alternatives representing the kind of different possible scenarios for the post-Brexit relations between the UK and the EU. So there's one alternative is the Norway option. The UK remains part of the European Economic Area and part of the single market. In that case, there would be no tariff barriers between the UK and the EU, but there would be some increase in non-tariff barriers. The UK, in that case, would be leaving the EU customs union, so it would be subject to things like anti-dumping duties and also to rules of origin on its trade with the rest of the EU. So when we simulate that case, we find a decline in the UK GDP per capita of 1.3%. Okay, and in some ways, that is the best case scenario in terms of minimizing the lost output following Brexit. A more costly scenario would be if the UK and the EU traded under World Trade Organization rules. Then you're talking about also introducing MFN tariffs on UK-EU trade, as well as much bigger increase in non-tariff barriers coming from a loss of access to the single market for services trade, but also regulatory divergence over time between the UK and the EU. So in that case, our estimates suggest a 2.6% decline in GDP per capita in the UK, so double the cost of the Norway option. Another policy that has been discussed quite a lot within the UK is what happens if, following Brexit, the UK decides to unilaterally remove all its import tariffs on trade with the entire world. So if you layer this on top of the WTO scenario, it does mitigate the lost output slightly, but the effect is relatively small. It drops to a 2.3% decline in GDP per capita. And the reason why that effect is so small is exactly what you might expect. Tariffs are already very low, around 3% on average. So there isn't a lot to be gained, or there just aren't big effects of changes in the tariffs, and it really is all about the non-tariff barriers and the more complicated, what Richard has called 21st century aspects of international trade. Okay? So that's the second approach, and that's kind of what's coming out of these quantitative trade models. Third approach that's been used is more of a kind of reduced form empirical approach, and it has two steps. First step, use the kind of gravity model specification of your choice to estimate how EU membership has affected the UK's, or how EU membership affects trade. So if you identify that off changes in membership of the EU, it's telling us that the UK's trade with other EU countries is about 1/4 higher than it otherwise would have been. And it doesn't suggest there's any significant evidence of trade diversion. Right? So roughly half the UK's trade is with the EU. So if we increase half of that trade by 1/4, total UK trade is going up by 1/8. And if you now combine that number with your preferred estimate of the elasticity of income to trade, and we use James Firer's work, which suggests an elasticity between 1/2 and 3/4, that's going to tell us that UK GDP per capita is going to decline by between 6.3 and 9.5% in the long run following Brexit. Okay? So this third approach, kind of however you do it, comes up with much bigger costs than are coming out of the quantitative trade models. Now, that could be due to errors in the estimation. That's obviously a possibility. But I think there's a couple of good reasons why we might expect this reduced form approach to produce a bigger number. It's picking up potentially any effects of trade on productivity, and it's also probably picking up effects of closer integration on investment, which are not in the quantitative models. Okay? So those are the kind of three approaches that have been taken. Obviously, there is no nice historical precedent we can study for Brexit. So each of these approaches has severe limitations, and there's ample scope for criticizing them. But if I can just stress kind of two bottom lines that is coming out of all the work that's been done in this area. Firstly, every credible bit of work on the economic consequence of Brexit is saying that it will decrease GDP per capita in the UK. And secondly, the size of that effect varies dramatically depending on our future relations with the EU. And what package of deals the UK and the EU now agree is really going to be crucial for how big an effect this turns out to be. Okay. So just to finish off then, I wanted to kind of highlight two things that are missing, I think, from the existing work and areas that haven't been taken into account. One is the UK's trade policy as regards the rest of the world. Could the UK outside the EU be in a better position to get a new deal with America or with China or with India? I'm skeptical that the UK will be in a better position for that, but it's one route that could offset some of the economic costs. Second issue, export platform investment is really important in the UK, and the reason for that is because we have access to the EU's single market. That's not well integrated into these estimates I've been talking about, but it's likely to be potentially very important, particularly for financial services. And I think Anil is going to talk about this a bit more later, but that's an area where we don't really understand very well how big the effects might be. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Third is Hélène Ray. I've asked her to talk about what Brexit means for macroeconomics, both in the UK and in Europe.
Brexit. So I'm going to start by talking about the effect on the UK economy, and I'm going to distinguish between the short run and the long run. Short run, so I think there are two main shocks. First, an uncertainty shock, large one, and the second one is a financial market shock. So let me start with the uncertainty shock. So we study political risk, but now we live it in the UK. After the 23rd of June, it became so clear that the people who were leading the Brexit campaign had actually no plan. And they have, one after the other, they have dropped out. Johnson dropped out, Gove is out, Lidsom is out, as of 2 days ago. And now we have Theresa May as the new prime minister, soon incoming. And as was pointed out was Richard, she has a position which so far is inconsistent with the EU position in terms of negotiation. She wants single market access, but she also wants restrictions to the full movement of labor, which seems to be a tough bargain to get. So we don't know what the negotiation will give. We don't know when they will start. We don't know how long this will last. So there is huge amount of uncertainty about future access to single market. And this is very, very important for the financial services, as was pointed out. So the financial passporting, in particular, is a key element for the competitiveness of the UK. Financial services are very important in exports of the UK. Britain has the highest ratio of services export to GDP in the G7, and financial services are a big part of that. So that's a huge question mark. There's also a huge amount of uncertainty about future labor flows. We don't know where we are going to get there. Theresa May has pretty strong views on this. We also don't know about the integrity even of the United Kingdom as a country, right? This is the United Kingdom. It's being right now not very united, and we actually could see a referendum in Scotland. So as a result of all this uncertainty, what we are starting to see is investment being delayed, hiring decisions being delayed. We also have more racist incidents. We also start to hear about migrants not so sure about whether their future is in England or not. So rather than a massive decline right now in consumption or investment, I think what we are seeing is more of a grinding process. We keep going for a while, but there's no new projects. So that's uncertainty. That's how uncertainty is playing out over time. So that's the uncertainty shock. Then we also have the financial market shock. So sterling fell to a 30-year low after the referendum. Mind you, if you read the Daily Mail the day after the referendum, you would not have known, because the Daily Mail reported that, yes, sterling fell a bit, but then it rallied. However, it seems to me sterling fell. There was also quite a bit of equity market volatility. And there it's interesting to see the very big difference between the FTSE 100 with the big, large multinational companies, which actually gained. Tobacco and mining went up, profits in dollars. That increased, the sterling depreciation increased the profits. But on the other hand, if you look at the more local FTSE 250, where you have the more smaller companies which are more British-centered, there the shock was much bigger. Among the most hit were the commercial real estate funds. The bank stocks went down by a lot, and also household goods and home constructions went down a lot. In the first 2 weeks after the referendum, they declined by 30%. Now, since construction investment accounts for about 9% of UK GDP, that's not a very, that doesn't bode very well for the short-run economic activity, and also, obviously, consumption in construction investment is a leading indicator of severe recessions. Consumer confidence has also fallen. Interestingly, it fell more in the regions which voted for Remain than in the regions which voted for Leave, but it fell to in the sharpest way in 20 years. Since consumption is something like 60% of UK domestic demand, again, and since it has been the biggest source of growth in the UK since 2012, I think it doesn't bode well for the short run in terms of economic activity. And this is what is reflected in the adjustment of the forecast that have just been given by the Commission, but also the ECB and the IMF, which have adjusted downwards the forecast of UK growth by 1 to 2 points between now and 2017. So that's for the short run. Now let's talk a tiny bit more about the medium to long horizon. Well, so will the resolution of uncertainty then lead to an investment boom, as some people have argued? Well, obviously, to me, it would depend how uncertainty is resolved. If we resolve it towards a Norwegian deal, then yes, probably we will see an investment pickup. If we have long negotiation and a stop in the flow of labor, then probably not. Does the sterling depreciation help? Well, so we have an experiment there of the 2007-2009 episode where sterling depreciated by a lot. In fact, it depreciated by 30% against the dollar during that period. And the UK trade deficit halved at that point. Now the UK current account deficit is, by the way, 7% of GDP, so it's not a small number. So the UK trade deficit halved between 2007 and 2011 due to the very sharp depreciation of the sterling, mainly due to the fall in British tourism in Europe, which went deeply down. And also there was some substitution towards UK exports, but there it was relatively limited. So during that former episode, a 10% reduction in UK export prices led to about 4% rise in exports only. And this was at a time where there was no issue about trade barriers, right? So we cannot be sure that this time around it's going to play exactly in the same way. Very briefly, because I'm at the end of my time, just want to talk about the effects of these macro developments on the EU economy. Very few points there. Also a downward revision to growth in the order of 0.2 to 0.5% of growth between now and 2017 for the rest of Europe, mainly due to trade and financial linkages. I mentioned tourism. That's one of these linkages. Now, what has been very interesting is that actually, if you look at some of the sharpest fall in stock prices following Brexit, these have come from the bank stocks of the periphery of the euro. And I think there's several reasons for that. So one is volatile values and confidence shock in an environment with high non-performing loans on the balance sheet of some of the banks of the periphery. But also, Brexit has increased the likelihood of low interest rates for longer, and this is eating bank profitability. Banking sectors are already not in a very good shape in Southern Europe. And I would add that one of the very big question marks that is hanging over our head is the political dynamics in the rest of Europe coming from Brexit. So how is it going to play out? Interestingly, perhaps because of the lack of leadership of the Brexiteers so far, the people of the extreme right parties in other European countries who had asked for a referendum have actually lost ground in the polls. So if you look at Mr. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, he actually lost some ground. Same thing in Austria. Marine Le Pen is stable. So we don't know how it's going to play out. But for the moment, there hasn't been a noticeable surge in the countries who were asking for a referendum following the great example of Brexit.
Very good. Very good. Lastly, Anil Kashyap is going to talk about what Brexit means for the City of London as a financial center.
Okay, thanks. I think economists should probably be careful talking about Brexit and its impact. I agree mostly with everything that's been said here, but all the economists were united in this beforehand, and 52% of the people ignored these predictions. And we probably need to step back and ask why, as experts, we've got such little credibility. I think it's degraded our ability to contribute to discussions, both in the United States and in the EU going forward, and it's something we ought to be reflecting upon. But my assignment today is to speculate, so I'm going to do that. My baseline prediction is going to be that financial services in the UK will probably shrink and shrink substantially. Just to put some more numbers on the table, there are about 1 million people in Great Britain that work in financial services. That's about 3.7% of the workforce, and that 3.7% of the workforce contributed in 2014 about 11.5% of the taxes. So regardless of what you think about bankers and financial services, the tax consequences of financial service migration outside of the UK will be important. And that's something that hasn't been stressed as much as I think it probably should be. Just think about them having to make up 5% of their taxes in steady state and work that through whatever model you want. That's not off the table. So why do I think Brexit will have adverse consequences? Well, just to elaborate on what Hélène was just saying, right now, if you're running a pan-European financial services firm out of London, it's pretty attractive. You get English language, you get UK law, you get UK labor regulation, and you don't have to face any discriminatory regulation. So that means no country-specific or EU-level regulations that can be selectively applied to UK firms. That's the whole point of what Richard was saying about the platform. London won that race when it was played on a level playing field. And they've lobbied heavily to protect the city's interests to make sure that that has been maintained. It's ironic that the highest EU commissioner at the time of the referendum was their representative who was in charge of financial services. Now, he's resigned. When Gordon Brown was holding the discussions over the euro, one of his 5 tests was protecting the city. So it's not an accident that the city has thrived. There's been a lot of effort put in to deliver that outcome. I think it's unlikely to be able to maintain that position after Brexit commences. I'm operating under the assumption that it will commence and that they won't try to go back for a second referendum or a vote in Parliament to thwart this. I can elaborate more, but basically I think that May, having been in the Remain campaign, has to cover the right flank and basically follow through. And she said as much 3 or 4 times. So I think we should assume that this is going to happen, regardless of whether that would be your recommendation. So once that happens, I agree with what Richard said, which is you cannot let the EU can't afford to be cherry-picked, and therefore you can't offer the UK a better deal than the one it has now, which seems to be the promise. So they're going to have to choose between having the current protections for the City of London or caving in on the movement of people part. So Norway, just to be clear, in its deal, if there were global Norwegian financial services firms, they could operate on the same footing that the UK firms have now. Once you step down from that, you lose that ability. So the Swiss, which have a model that's another one they could try to implement, the Swiss started with its decision not to join the EU. They immediately passed 7 bilateral treaties that regularized a lot of the arrangements between Switzerland and the EU, but they did not get passporting rights for their financial services firms. So there are limitations there. And what that means is that you can't do everything with one-stop shopping. You may need bilateral permissions. There may be provisions that the EU can put up that makes it discriminatory if you want to be based in Switzerland, for instance. So I think even the Swiss outcome would probably make it bad. Now, the obvious question comes then, why can't you just keep booking everything in your subs that are operated outside of London, somewhere in the EU, and keep all the people and revenues inside the UK? And I'd say there's 3 reasons why I doubt that will happen. First, I think some of the countries will want to put sand in the gears just to make this disadvantageous. The French have said already on several occasions that they think if Britain is out, or if the UK is out, that things ought to migrate into an EU country. So there'll be some of that. The second is that the EU regulators, I think, will be very, very hesitant to let all this happen inside the UK, where they would not have any formal authority. The UK and the EU regulations post the financial crisis are not fully harmonized. The UK was embarking on a set of measures to move in the direction of normalizing everything. That would have kept their passporting rights in the level playing field, but that requires the UK to follow through with this. So right now, who knows if the EU is going to want to adopt everything to be fully compatible with the EU without knowing what the deal is going to be like. And on top of that, I think it would be really, really difficult to preserve any of this if the UK responds to the pressure it's under by kind of lowering the bar and racing to the bottom. If they try to make their business location more appealing, that's going to make the regulators inside the EU all the more hesitant to say this can just go on in London and you know, we're not going to have management close to people. If you talk to senior financial services people, they tell you in the end, your regulator wants to know you and see you all the time. And this idea that you're booking all this stuff in Luxembourg but actually living in London isn't sustainable in the medium term. If you put up some sand in the gears on top of it, I think it becomes all the less realistic and feasible. It becomes a hassle. Eventually, they move. Finally, I think the ace in the hole is really the ability to walk in and terminate an entire trading division or a whole group of people without having to make big severance payments. Right now in France and Germany, you can't do that. That's one of the big advantages London has. You can let go 500 people and you don't have to make a huge side payment. I expect some country in the EU will pass special legislation that makes it easier to fire bankers en masse. Once that's done, the stickiness of London goes away. And it's important to realize over the last 20 years, the people that live in and work in the London financial services industry has transformed. It used to be it was heavily English, or certainly people based in the UK that had grown up there. Now it's MBAs from all over the world that have passports from everywhere who have no allegiance to London. So the stickiness is just not there. So for all those reasons, I don't think they're going to be able to pull this off without completely capitulating on the movement of people, and I think that would be viewed as a betrayal. Okay, so I'm out of time. We could talk about some of these other things, but I just want to reiterate, I think the take it or leave it thing is really critical. So I think you should be assuming that what'll be easy to implement will be either Norway, some version of Switzerland, or some version of WTO Canada. But a bespoke deal is going to be really hard. And even if they go for one of those off-the-shelf things, it still may take them years and years to complete. And in the meantime, I think the financial services will kind of bleed out slowly.
Thank you. I'm now going to invite each of the panelists to react to what each other has said. Not everybody has to react to everything, but whoever has something to say in any order. Richard.
So I basically agree with what everybody said. So I'll just extend a little bit on what Anil ended with. Will it happen or will it not? And I think Theresa May has made it very clear that she's going to start the talks for Brexit, and that there's the idea that we would have a Parliament preventing Article 50 from being triggered. That's not going to happen. A second referendum in the near term, that's not going to happen. So, I mean, I think the only way it could happen is that she triggers Article 50 at the end of the year. It takes 2 years of negotiation, and once they see what the deal looks like, they're going to get EEA, for example, or membership, then they might hold another referendum to say, do you want this or do you want that? But that is January 1st, 2019, and that's after 2.5 years of uncertainty. Uncertainty for people who are living in Britain and don't know what their place will be, whether their children should go to education there or whether they should leave, and uncertainty in terms of building businesses and investment. And 2.5 years of that kind of uncertainty, especially if you might think that there's going to be a referendum at the end of it, so there's even more uncertainty, that can lead to hysteresis, both in terms of the labor force and in terms of where manufacturing is actually located and where finance is actually located. So if you remember, all of Europe is losing world share of manufacturing. So we're not talking about gaining shares, it's losing it more slowly. So once that stuff goes, it's not at all clear that even if they did decide to stay, that it would come back. And then that's just to riff on what Hélène said about the uncertainty in Europe. So there are 3 referendums in October this year, each of which could cause some scary things to happen. They're going to rerun the presidential election in Austria. which almost, well, we're going to rerun the election in Austria. And then there's going to be a constitutional referendum in Italy about changing the way they things. But the way it's viewed now is the prime minister is linked to the success of that. And if he drops down, the next party up is an anti-EU party. So that could cause all sorts of problems because Italy has 130% debt in somebody else's currency. So even the thought that they could leave could be very disruptive. And lastly, there's a referendum in Hungary about more or less disrespecting some rules of the Commission, which would lead to a problem with the EU. So it's a worrying thing going forward. But in terms of probability of it actually happening, I think it's at least over half, because when we get there, they will have gone so far down that path, they'll probably leave. But that's where I put it.
So, I mean, I wanted to pick up on the question of whether Brexit will actually happen. And I think one useful way to think about that question is to look at what is the political coalition that has actually just voted for Brexit. And it's a bit of an unusual coalition in UK terms. It's a combination of traditional conservative voters, typically people who are reasonably well off, kind of would be sort of little England, small c conservative voters. But it's a coalition of that group with more kind of voters who would traditionally maybe have voted for Labour and have suffered a lot in the changes that have hit the UK economy over the last 20 or 30 years, right? And this is the group that is potentially particularly upset about the effects of globalization and migration. And kind of the point I want to make here is that this is not a coalition that has existed really in UK politics before, and it is a coalition that right now is putting pressure on Theresa May to initiate these negotiations and to try and find a solution for the UK to leave the EU. But it might not turn out to be a stable coalition, particularly when we do see 2 years of uncertainty of lower growth. It's far from clear that this coalition for Brexit will still exist 2 or 3 years down the line. So I think that casts a reasonable doubt over, will we ever actually see Brexit happen?
So I agree with all that has been said. I just want to emphasize also a point that Anil made on the difficulty for the city to remain what it is really, because of, in particular, in all the business which is related to the euro and the clearing of euro transactions, where it has already been made pretty clear by the continent that it would be very difficult to keep a financial center with a lot of transactions in euros in a place where EU regulation doesn't have any reach. So then the question is exactly how the business can be carved out and in how many pieces. And we start to see, discussions about what type of businesses will move and what type of business will stay. But as I pointed out when I talked about this uncertainty shock, I think uncertainty is indeed a grinding process, which in the short run what you see is a little bit business as usual, but no investment, no new projects being undertaken. And as time goes by and uncertainty drags on, you see more and more of the effect coming through. And the question is going to be, as more and more the effects are coming through, what effects will that have on the dynamics of this coalition that my neighbor just talked about? And that's, I really don't know how it's going to play out.
Okay, I'll just say one other thing, which is now that Europe's taken a step backwards for the first time in 50 years, I think we should be worried that you won't be able to stop at just one of these. I mean, you're now going to have to sustain votes in many different locations. I mean, Richard pointed out the 3 that are coming, but you've got French elections, you've got German elections. You could imagine if the recession is not extremely sharp and deep, that eventually the separatist parties in other places are going to get almost goaded into it. Well, the Brits did it. Why aren't we pushing hard enough in pick your favorite breakaway region or country? And so I've never was confident that the EU or the euro, which the public can't tell the difference, if you were to actually put this to a vote, that you would actually have made it. It hasn't had that many affirmative votes. So the odds of just an accident, just if you have enough of these votes, someone else is going to vote to do it, and then it really gets to be a mess, especially if it's somebody that's inside the euro. So it's fraught with danger. I think it, it could easily be the case that in 2 years there will be another referendum as to, okay, now we know what we're actually voting on, so we'll reconsider. But over those 2 years, there's a lot of downside risks, and a lot of the stuff may migrate in the meantime. And if they do, that's kind of a level effect that I don't see reversing.
So that completes the on-the-record segment of the program. When we go